Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, Ukrainian, Serhiy Pavlovich Korolyov, also transliterated as Sergei Pavlovich Korolyov, the 12th of January 1907 to 14 January 1966, worked as the lead Soviet rocket engineer and spacecraft designer during the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s. He is considered by many as the father of practical astronautics. Although Korolev trained as an aircraft designer, his greatest strengths proved to be in design integration, organization and strategic planning. Arrested for alleged mismanagement of funds, he was imprisoned in 1938 for almost 6 years, including some months in a Kolyma labor camp. Following his release, he became a recognized rocket designer and a key figure in the development of the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile program. He was then appointed to lead the Soviet space program and made a member of Soviet Academy of Sciences, overseeing the early successes of the Sputnik and Vostok projects that included launching Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin into space, making him the first human to enter orbit on the 12th of April 1961. By the time he died unexpectedly in 1966, Korolev's plans to compete with the United States to become the first nation to land a man on the moon had begun to be implemented. Before his death, he was often referred to only as the chief designer, because the Soviet leadership feared that the United States would send agents to assassinate him. Only many years later, upon his death, did he receive public recognition as the driving force behind Soviet successes in space. Early life. Korolev was born in Zhytomyr, modern Ukraine. His father, Pavel Yakovlevich Korolev, was from Belarusian Mogilev, and his mother, Maria Nikolaevna Koroleva, was Ukrainian, born in a wealthy Nezan merchant family. His father had originally moved to Zhytomyr to be a teacher of the Russian language. 3 years after his birth, the couple separated due to financial difficulties. At the time, Korolev was informed by his mother that his father had died, and only later learned that Pavel had lived until 1929. The two never met after the family breakup, although Pavel later wrote to Maria requesting a meeting with his son. Korolev grew up in Nezan, under the care of his maternal grandparents Mykola Yakovich Moskalenko, who was a trader of the Second Guild, and Maria Matvievna Moskalenko, a daughter of a local Cossack. Korolev's mother also had a sister Anna and 2 brothers Yuri and Vasily. Maria Koroleva had wanted the higher education, and so she was frequently away attending women's higher education courses in Kiev. As a child, Korolev was stubborn, persistent, and argumentative. Sergei grew up a lonely child with few friends. This was largely due to the fact of his smaller stature and favoritism with teachers. The subject of jealousy from his peers, Korolev proved to be quite the student, excelling in maths and other subjects. He also began to read at an early age. As stated in an interview, the torment of other kids bullying and teasing him later fueled him as he continued with his work, as he proved a good student, especially in mathematics. In 1915 his mother got divorced, and in 1916 married Grigory Mikhailovich Balanin, an electrical engineer with a German education, attending the Kiev Polytechnic University because of the non-recognition of German engineering diplomas in Russia. Grigory proved a good influence on the child. Grigory moved the family to Odessa in 1917, after getting a job with the regional railway. The year 1918 was tumultuous in Russia, with the close of World War I and the ongoing Russian Revolution. The internecine struggles continued until the Bolsheviks assumed unchallenged power in 1920. During this period, the local schools were closed and young Korolev had to continue his studies at home. In 1919 there were severe food shortages, and Korolev suffered from a bout of typhus. Even after this the family suffered through hard times, as did much of the remainder of the nation. Education. Korolev continued his schooling at the Odessa Building Trade School, where he received vocational training in carpentry and in various academics. His primary interest was in aeronautical engineering, perhaps due to the influence of an air show he had enjoyed back in 1913. Korolev began designing a glider plane during his free time while he studied for his graduation exams at the vocational school. He made an independent study of flight theory, and also worked in the local glider club. A detachment of military seaplanes had been stationed in Odessa, and Korolev took a keen interest in their operations. In 1923, he joined the Society of Aviation and Aerial Navigation of Ukraine and the Crimea. By joining the Odessa hydroplane squadron, he had his first flying lesson, and also had many opportunities to fly as a passenger. In 1924 he personally designed a glider called the K5, which was accepted by the OAV UK as a construction project. At about the same time he also trained to become accomplished as a gymnast, but his academic work began to suffer from his distractions with these other interests. Korolev had hoped to go to Moscow and attend the Zhukovsky Academy. His qualifications did not meet the Academy's standards. To pursue his interests, he decided in 1924 to attend the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, as they had an aviation branch. In Kiev he lived with his uncle Yuri, and he earned money to pay for his courses by performing odd jobs. His curriculum was technically oriented, and included various engineering, physics and mathematics classes. He met and became attracted to a classmate, Xenia Vincentini, who would later become his first wife. In 1925 he was accepted into a limited class on glider construction. He was allowed to fly the training glider on which he worked, but ended up with 2 broken ribs. He continued with his courses, completing his second year in 1926. In July of that year he was accepted into the Bauman Moscow State Technical University. Until 1929, Korolev studied specialized topics in aviation at the school. He lived with his family, who had moved to Moscow, in what were typical but crowded conditions. In addition to his studies, Korolev had more opportunities to fly gliders and powered aircraft, and he reveled in the experience. He also designed a glider in 1928, and flew it in a competition the next year. During 1929 the Communist Party had decreed that the education of engineers be accelerated to meet the country's urgent need for the skills. Korolev could obtain a diploma by producing a practical aircraft design, and had the design completed and approved by the end of the year. His advisor was none other than Andrei Tupolev. Early career. Having graduated, Korolev began work at an aircraft design bureau designated OP-04, or 4th Experimental Section. It was headed by a Frenchman named Paul-Émile Richard, who emigrated to USSR in the 1920s and included a number of the Soviet Union's best designers. He did not stand out in this group, but while so employed he also worked privately on a pair of personal design projects. One of these was a glider design that was capable of performing aerobatics. By 1930 he became a lead engineer on the Tupolev DB-3 heavy bomber. In 1930, Korolev finally earned his pilot's license. The next year, on the 6th of August, he married Xenia Vincentini, a woman he had been courting since 1924. He had proposed marriage to her back then, but she declined as she wanted a higher education. It was during 1930 that Korolev became interested in the possibilities of liquid-fueled rocket engines. His interest was primarily in aircraft. He saw the potential for use of these engines to propel airplanes. It was one day, while he was flying around, that he looked up and wondered about what was beyond the point of where he could take his plane and how he could get there. Many believe this was the start of his interest in space. In 1931, together with Friedrich Zander, a space travel enthusiast, he participated in the creation of the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion, one of the earliest state-sponsored centers for rocket development in the USSR. In May 1932, Korolev was appointed chief of the group. During the following years, GERD developed 3 different propulsion systems, each more successful than the last. In 1932, the military became interested in the efforts of this group, and began providing some funding. In 1933, the group accomplished the first launch of a liquid-fueled rocket, which was called GERD-X. This was just 17 years after Colonel Ivan Platonovich Graves' first launch in 1916. In 1934, Korolev published the work Rocket Flight in Stratosphere. With growing military interest in this new technology, it was decided by the government in 1933 to merge GERD with the Gas Dynamics Laboratory in Leningrad. The merger created the Jet Propulsion Research Institute, headed up by the military engineer Ivan Klimanov and containing a number of enthusiastic proponents of space travel, including Valentin Glashko. Korolev became the deputy chief of the institute. He led the development of cruise missiles and a manned rocket-powered glider. On the 10th of April 1935, Korolev's wife gave birth to their daughter, Natasha. In 1936 they were able to move out of his parents' home and into their own apartment. Both Korolev and his wife had careers, and Sergei always spent long hours at his design office. By now he was chief engineer at RNII. The RNII team continued the development work on rocketry, with particular focus on the area of stability and control. They developed automated gyroscope stabilization systems that allowed stable flight along a programmed trajectory. Korolev was a charismatic leader who served primarily as an engineering project manager. He was a demanding, hard-working man, with a disciplinary style of management. Korolev personally monitored all key stages of the programs and paid meticulous attention to detail. Imprisonment. On the 22nd of June 1938, during the Great Purge, Korolev was arrested by the NKVD after being denounced by Ivan Klimanov, Georgy Langemak, and Valentin Glashko. He was accused of deliberately slowing the work of the Research Institute, and following torture in the Lubyanka prison to extract a confession, was tried and sentenced to death. But the purge was waning and Korolev served 10 years in a Gulag work camp. Korolev later learned that he had been denounced by Glashko, and this may have been the cause of the lifelong animosity between the two men. Glashko and Korolev had reportedly been denounced by Andrei Kostakov, who became the head of RNII after its leadership was arrested. Believing that his arrest was a mistake, Korolev read many appeals to the authorities, including Stalin himself. Following the fall of the NKVD head, Nikolai Yezhov, the new chief Lavrentiy Beria chose to retry Korolev on reduced charges in 1939. But by the time Korolev was on his way from prison to a Gulag camp in the far east of Siberia, where he spent several months in a gold mine in the Kolyma area before word reached him of his retrial. In the work camp, conditions were extremely rough: inadequate food, shelter, clothing, work assignments, and thousands of prisoners dying each month. Towards the end of 1939 he was sent back to Moscow, but but he had already sustained injuries and had lost most of his teeth due to the labor camp's brutal conditions. Scurvy, for example. When he reached Moscow, Korolev's sentence was reduced to 8 years, which he did not have to serve in a labor camp. He rarely talked about his experience in the Gulag. Other members of the RNII had also been arrested. Klemenov and Langemak were executed, leaving Korolev very fortunate to have even survived. The rocket program was set back for years and fell far behind the rapid progress taking place in Germany. Korolev was assigned to Sharashka, a penitentiary for intellectuals and the educated. These were effectively slave labor camps where scientists and engineers worked on projects assigned by the Communist Party leadership. The Central Design Bureau 29 of the NKVD served as Topolev's engineering facility, and Korolev was brought here to work for his old mentor. During World War II, this Sharashka designed both the Tupolev Tu-2 bomber and the Petlyakov P-2 dive bomber. The group was moved several times during the war, the first time to avoid capture by advancing German forces. In 1942, Korolev managed to be moved to the Sharashka of Kazan OKB-16 under Valentin Glashko, which designed rocket-assisted takeoff boosters for aircraft. Korolev was kept in the Sharashka and isolated from his family until 1944. He lived under constant fear of being executed for the military secrets he possessed, and was deeply affected by his time in the camp, becoming reserved and cautious. On the 27th of June 1944, Korolev, along with Tupolev, Glashko and others, was finally discharged by special government decree, although the charges against him were not dropped until 1957. The Design Bureau was handed over from NKVD control to the government's Aviation Industry Commission. Korolev continued working with the Bureau for another year, serving as deputy designer under Glashko and studying various rocket designs. In 1944, Korolev and Glashko designed the Rode-1 kHz auxiliary rocket motor tested in an unsuccessful fast-climb Lavochkin LA-7R. Ballistic Missiles. In 1945, Korolev was awarded the Badge of Honor, his first decoration, for his work on the development of rocket motors for military aircraft. The same year he was commissioned into the Red Army, with the rank of colonel. Along with other experts, he flew to Germany to recover the technology of the German V-2 rocket. The Soviets placed a priority on reproducing lost documentation on the V-2, and studying the various parts and captured manufacturing facilities. That work continued in East Germany until late 1946, when the Soviet experts and some 150 German scientists and engineers were sent to Russia. Most of the German experts, with the exception of Helmut Grotrup, were those involved in wartime mass production of V-2, and they had never worked directly with Wernher von Braun. The leading German rocket scientists, including Dr. von Braun himself, surrendered to Americans and were transported to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. Stalin had decided to make rocket and missile development a national priority, and a new institute was created for the purpose, the NII-88 in the suburbs of Moscow. For the German engineers, Branch 1 of NII-88 was set up on Gorodimlia Island in the Lake Seliga, some 200 kilometers from Moscow. The facility was surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Although Boris Chertok, chief designer of guidance and control systems, notes in his book Rockets and People, all structures on Gorodimlia Island were renovated and living conditions were quite decent for those times. At least married specialists received separate 2- or 3-room apartments. Visiting the island, I could only envy them. them, because I and my family lived in Moscow in a shared 4-room apartment, where we had 2 rooms of 24 square meters combined. Many of our specialists and workers lived in barracks without most elementary necessities. This is why life on the island behind barbed wire could not compare at all to prisoner of war conditions. Development of ballistic missiles was put under the military control of Dmitry Ustinov, with Korolev serving as the chief designer of long-range missiles at the Special Design Bureau 1 of NI-88. Korolev demonstrated his organizational abilities in this new facility, keeping a dysfunctional and highly compartmentalized organization operating, with the blueprints reproduced. Thanks in part to disassembled V-2 rockets, the team now began producing a working replica of the rocket. This was designated the R-1, and was first tested in October 1947. A total of 11 were launched, 5 hitting the target. This was comparable to the German hit ratio, and demonstrated the unreliability of the rocket. The Soviets continued to utilize the expertise of the Germans on V-2 technology for some time, in the regime of secrecy surrounding the ballistic missile program. Grotrup and his team had no access to classified work of the Russian colleagues on new rocket technology, as well as adequate production and testing facilities. This made any meaningful development impossible and negatively affected the morale of the German team. In 1950, the Ministry of Defense made an official decision to dissolve the German team and repatriate the German engineers and the families. The first group was sent to Germany in December 1951, and the last in November 1953. In 1947, Korolev's group began working on more advanced designs, with improvements in range and throw weight. The R-2 doubled the range of the V-2, and was the first design to utilize a separate warhead. This was followed by the R-3, which had a range of 3,000 kilometers, and thus could target England. Glushko couldn't get the engines to develop the required thrust, and the project was cancelled in 1952. Later in the same year, work began on the R-5, which had a more modest 1,200 kilometers range. It completed a first successful flight by 1953. The first true intercontinental ballistic missile, not only in USSR but in the whole world, was the R-7 Semyorka. This was a 2-stage rocket with a maximum payload of 5.4 tons, sufficient to carry the Soviets' bulky nuclear bomb on an impressive distance of 7,000 kilometers. After several test failures, the R-7 successfully launched on August 1957, sending a dummy payload to Kamchatka Peninsula. In 1952, Korolev joined the Soviet Communist Party, a tactical necessity if he was to request money from the government for his future projects. On the 19th of April 1957, he was fully rehabilitated, as the government acknowledged that his sentence was unjust.